Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is James Prosek. James is an artist, writer, and naturalist whose work deeply examines our relationship with the natural world. Over the course of his career, he's focused his artist eye and philosopher's mind on everything from trout to eels, from birds to ocean fishes. And for the past 2 years, he's been focused on understanding and documenting the grasslands of Texas. And he's traveled the state examining the diverse plants and wildlife that call the prairie ecosystem home. Beginning on September 16, 2023, the results of his journeys around Texas will be on display at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. In his new exhibition titled Trespassers, James Prosek and the Texas Prairie. James was born in Connecticut, and as you'll hear in this conversation, much of his childhood was spent obsessed with birds, fish, and fishing. He attended Yale University, where at age 19 he published his first book, titled Trout, An Illustrated History, which featured 70 of his watercolor paintings of the trout of North America. From there, his curiosity about the natural world continued to intensify, as evidenced by his prolific production of art and writing for many renowned museums and publications. He's also lent his talents to a variety of conservation efforts, most notably his partnership with Yvon Chionard to protect coldwater fisheries habitat. James and I share many mutual friends and interests, so it was wonderful to connect with him for this conversation. It'll only take you a few minutes of listening to realize that James is a deep thinker, whose art is the manifestation of his extremely nuanced and fascinating ideas and philosophies. We started out talking about his first memory of interacting with nature, and how he's used drawing and journaling as tools to better understand plants, animals, and concepts. We talk about how the idea of naming plants and animals is an imperfect science, how drawing connects us with our evolutionary past, how philosophy and philosophical thinking inform all of his art. We talk about grasslands in Texas, the importance of understanding and respecting place, how James snaps out of creative slumps, his writing process, and he offers plenty of great book recommendations. As is the case with so many of my guests, I could have talked to James for many more hours. So thankfully, this conversation is part one of what will be a 2-episode series with James. The second episode will be a live event at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art on Thursday, January 11th, 2024. We'll be continuing this conversation, and we'll be focusing in more detail on his exploration of the Texas prairie and his new exhibition, Trespassers. We'll be releasing more information about this event soon, but I'd love to see some of you at the event in Fort Worth on January 11th. A huge thank you to James for his inspiring art, to the Amon Carter Museum for the opportunity to chat with James, and to all of you for listening. Hope you enjoy. All right, James, I am so excited to be chatting with you, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the last few months, and I'm so happy that the folks at the Amon Carter Museum introduced us. And then it turns out we got so many mutual friends. So in some ways, I don't feel like I'm talking to a stranger at all. But I've just absolutely loved digging into all your work and reading about your background and watching videos of you. By any standard, I've probably been stalking you, but I'm not. But first question would be, what's your first memory of interacting with nature? Whether that is holding a bird, whether that was your first time catching a fish, whether that was a trip out with your dad. I know he was instrumental in your love of nature. Do you have a first memory that is kind of burned into your brain of your first experience in the natural world?
Gosh, that's a really good question. First of all, it's an honor to be here with you, and I equally have been stalking you and admire your work. So, sometimes we tie our earliest memories to a photograph. And back when I was a kid, I was born in 1975, we didn't have digital phones and took pictures of our kids every 30 seconds. So there may be, a couple dozen photographs from my first 9 or 10 years. There's a memory I have of, I think, being held by my mom and a blooming rhododendron, and also being carried by my father across the meadows here on the street where I grew up. I actually lived 2 houses away from the house where I grew up. So I have a strong sense of place, I think, or at least I've seen this land change over the years. The emergence of a monarch butterfly from a chrysalis, walking through the fields here. My father also took me to this Audubon sanctuary in Fairfield, Connecticut, and there's particular points on the trails that I can still remember, even though I haven't been there in probably 30 years. It's not that far from where I live, but where these two ponds connected and this meadow. It's funny that I feel like I have more or stronger memories of meadows than of like the woods, and even more maybe than water, even though water has been a huge part of my life, because from 9 to 22 I was deeply obsessed with fishing and fish, in particular trout. But yeah, I remember seeing certain birds. I remember the old farmer on the street, Mr. Ketchel, and how he used to limp. He was also our bus driver. But I remember there were still some dairy cows on our street because there was a farm. And I remember the cows getting out and being in our front yard.
Yeah.
If you asked me that tomorrow, I'd probably have a different first memory. But those are, yeah, they're pretty deeply tied to the area around where I grew up.
One of the things that I was fascinated about that I just caught a glimpse of, I think it was in the really great TED Talk you did for the Yale TEDx, which I'll link to in the episode notes. I think there was a photo of some journals that you had kept as a kid. And it seems that writing and journaling has been a very important part of your life since very, very early childhood. Can you talk about that? When did journaling begin to be a practice that you leaned on so heavily, both for just jotting down events, but also for your artistic process?
Well, I started drawing before I started keeping a journal. And my first drawings were of birds. And I drew them from copying John James Audubon's work and Roger Torrey Peterson and Luis Agassiz Fuertes and these Audubon books and whatever magazines were around. I actually was kind of obsessed with like tropical birds. My father grew up in Brazil, so maybe that's why. Yeah. But I would draw like parrots and things. But I didn't start keeping it. Also, I loved warblers, which these colorful migrants that we have that spend the winter in Central and South America and spend the summers up here, maybe because they also kind of migrated north like my father did. He was born in Brazil, and he'd tell me stories about the beautiful birds down there and how they'd capture them and keep them in cages and then let them go.
Yeah.
But I started keeping a journal at around 11, and I've kept a journal ever since. I have those early journals, and I wrote on the cover "Outdoor Journal."
Yeah.
And I would write what I did every day, but really I would write something every day. But again, fishing was such a big part of my life that I would really only write something extensively, like more than a paragraph, if I'd gone fishing. If I hadn't gone fishing that day, I just wrote no fishing. So most of the days, I would say, out of the year said no fishing, but I would say like 100 days at least out of the year, maybe even 200. I don't know. I would get out at least, for a couple minutes on the pond across the street from where I grew up, or the reservoir down the street. So I also kept a tally of every single fish that I caught. So there was not a lot of personal reflection early on. It was kind of more documentary, but I also made sketches in the journal related to things that I saw, experiences I had, particular rigs that worked for fishing, or recipes for flies that I was tying. I was pretty obsessed, but drawing has been the most consistent thread throughout my life. And I have thoughts about, because I ask myself, or ask humanity, why do we draw? What's the point? I mean, most kids pick up a pencil and draw at some point until somebody tells them they're no good at it anymore or something, or there's no more art class in school. But I really believe in drawing as a aid to strengthening your skills of observation, really learning. When you draw something, you're really forced to look at it very closely. And I've started to think that drawing's very, very closely linked with our early predatory past in history, at a time when we were hunter-gatherers and we needed to capture and kill our food to survive. Because what drawing is it's a mark that you make that documents an action in time. So if I took my hand covered in blood and sort of stuck it on a rock wall,
Yeah.
That's the residue of something that happened in the past. And if those marks could be protected, then they could communicate things through many generations. What predates drawing probably was following the passive marks made by animals in the mud and the snow through tracking. And tracking allowed animal tracks are essentially kind of passive drawings made by animals
Yeah.
that, record the direction they're moving in, how quickly they're moving, how long ago they were there. So even though the animal's not there anymore, we could, through experience, read those marks, follow those animals, and become more efficient at catching and killing them. The moment that we humans also were making passive marks by just walking on the ground. But once we took those marks that were passive and started making them intentionally, like taking the track off the ground and putting it on the wall, like as a drawing, that was, I think, an extremely pivotal moment in human history because those marks allowed us to basically, it was the beginning of recorded history. It was really maybe even the beginning of self-awareness, because if you take your hand covered in pigment or blood and you push it against a surface and the mark is left there, you have something you can reflect back on and say, it's almost like I am here. It's an acknowledgement of our existence. I could go on and on, but I think a lot about drawing and the power in drawing. And I think still, despite all the ways that we can communicate information digitally now, like texting each other on the phone, what's the mark made by an individual is still possibly the most direct way to manifest a thought. Like, how do you get a thought from your brain onto a surface where it can be recorded and then, passed on to another human communication wise? And I still think that a drawing or even writing that's done by hand carries more information of an individual experience than a mark made by typing, because the typed marks are standardized.
Yeah.
And they don't reflect the individuality of the person who made it. So yeah, I marvel at how I can make a living using some of the most primitive tools that humans have ever used, a wooden handled brush with animal hair, or a piece of graphite or charcoal or pigment, minerals crushed and suspended in tree sap and slathered on a surface made of, cotton and tree pulp, despite the fact, again, that we have these very sophisticated devices. There's still something that humans respond to about something that's made by hand with materials from the earth. And I don't think that will go away. And I hope that in the coming age of AI that perhaps the human individual mark will become even more novel, maybe even coveted or sought after. That's the hope anyway, as opposed to becoming obsolete, because a machine can do it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that brings me, I've been thinking a lot for some reason, probably too much time on my hands or something, but I've been thinking about cheap communication and cheap interaction versus rich or meaningful interaction. And I think, like, for example, a text is great. Like, you and I were able to text and get all this crazy technology set up, and that's great. But a handwritten note is much better, and it requires effort on my part. It requires the expense of sending it to you, and that's more meaningful, I think, in a lot of ways. And I feel like you're obviously an extremely talented artist, but you're also such an expert. You're an expert naturalist. You're an expert in history. You go so deep in the topics that you decide to focus your artistic eye on. And I read somewhere, I think I read when I was preparing for this, that drawing, like for example, drawing fish made you a better fisherman because you were forced to go deep. Can you talk about just how that act of slowing down, taking it all in, and kind of forcing your brain to make your hand do a certain thing makes you understand it all better?
Yeah, that's definitely an extension of what I was just talking about. Yeah. And I started drawing as a young kid, and I was drawing birds first because my dad kind of introduced me to nature through his love of birds. And then around the age of 9, a friend of mine introduced me to fishing, and I don't know where that comes from, a total passion / fanaticism. But I was sort of like, I couldn't not think about fishing or being out on the water. And so my drawings kind of turned from birds into fish, and I fell deeply in love with the fish in the area around where I grew up, but in particular trout. And our native trout is the brook trout, which is actually technically most closely related to Arctic char. I started drawing these trout, and I was drawing the fish that I was catching from my local river, the Mill River, which has native brook trout and introduced brown trout. And I was photographing the fish with my dad's old Nikkermet 35 millimeter camera. So I was documenting the fish. Almost every fish I caught, I was taking pictures of them. But I was drawing them because I would let the fish go, and the colors fade so quickly after you take them out of the water. So a combination of my memory of being there and the photographs, I would draw the fish. And I felt like when I was drawing a fish, I was reliving the experience in a way that I couldn't recover when I was writing about it or talking about it. It was like I would get in almost this trance-like state where I would have these like lucid dreams of being on the water, and I could hear the fly buzzing by my head and smell the smells and hear the sounds. And so drawing did something for me that kind of like internalized the experience, like got it deeply under my skin. And as I was drawing the fish, I was also thinking about catching it. And I felt like it really focused my attention on that creature in a way that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't drawing it. So I really felt like drawing the fish made me more efficient at catching them, because it brought my mind to a place or a level of observation that it like trained my brain in a certain way. And I sort of feel like maybe drawing had helped to shape our perceptions as, again, early hunter-gatherers, that by drawing the animal we were going out to hunt or trap or capture to eat, that we came to know it better, and that drawing, for the person who drew the thing, but also for the person who was observing the drawing, in a practical way, it allowed you to kind of discuss the animal when it wasn't with you, because the experiences you have with the animal are relatively fleeting. If you can make a representation of the animal on the wall of a cave, for instance, and then go to that drawing and use it as a tool to communicate where to throw the spear or strategize in the hunt, the drawing created a secondary nature in a way, like a point through which you could relive or even relive an experience or anticipate a future experience. So it was an aid for like a rehearsal almost, so that when you went back out hunting or fishing or trapping, your brain had been kind of thinking through different ways to, be efficient
sure.
as a survivor. But there was something else though, that drawing, this close observation led me to this other kind of, I guess maybe I could call it revelation, because I was photographing all these fish in my local stream. I was looking at the pictures one day and I was like, that's the same fish. Like I'd caught the same fish because I was letting them go like 3 or 4 times over a year and a half. And I never thought of fish as individuals before.
Mm-hmm.
I thought of them as like, I grew up with these field guides, as we all did, where there's pictures of birds lined up, neatly and orderly, like soldiers in a battalion on one side of the page, and on the opposite page there's a list of names that match up to the animals. And it's like a cardinal or a swordfish. There's one picture to represent that entire species. I don't think I'd thought about fish as individuals like we do our pets until I started really drawing them and looking at them closely. And then I realized that I'd caught this same fish by this particular rock, and that they're actually kind of territorial. And I think that this was the beginning of a larger inquiry of mine about, how we name and order the natural world, and what happens when we put words onto a world that doesn't have words on it. Words, like drawings, are representations of things. Like I say the word tree, and it's using sound, but it allows us to conjure an image of a tree when it's not in front of us. Like you and I can think of a tree right now, even if we're in a dark room. Just like if I show you a drawing of a trout, we can conjure maybe experiences we had with those fish. We have to, in order to communicate, one of the things we have to do is reduce the complexity to these concepts. So because we can't name every individual tree, Juliet, Harry, Mark, we have to come up with a term where we can dump all the trees into one term, which kind of does this violence to the particularity of every individual tree. Yeah. But we can't have a system of communication where every tree has an individual name. So when we learn about nature, we learn about a cat and a cow and a fish, and that's fine. But we're not really taught that these animals are individuals with their own personalities and personal experiences, which changes the way you look at nature, I think. So we reduce complexity, and we also take this holistic, interconnected nature, and we draw lines between things. And we say, again, this is a trout, this is a cow, this is a cat. When really in an ecosystem, everything in the world is affecting the fates of everything else just by existing. Yeah. So in a sense, yes, there are things such as species. In another sense, there really aren't.
Yeah, it's always changing.
It's always changing, and it's all integrated. But we forget because we learn through language. So you say to your kid, you show them a picture of a cat, and they say, "Yeah, that's a cat." It's not a cat, really. It's a drawing of a cat. But that's beside the point. But what we forget, because we like the neatness of the systems we create to communicate, but we forget that these are just maps that we use to navigate the world, and that the actual world is something very different than the map. I'm not saying that language is bad, but we have to remind ourselves that it's a tool, and all tools have limitations, and actually the limitations are also good. That's another topic that I can get into, but basically I think your question was, how did drawing, shape my experiences as a predator? Yeah. And I think and I use predator in a good sense. I mean, really when we were hunting and fishing and growing things to survive, capturing our own food, we had to know the world on a very intimate level, as you know. I mean, if you don't know the habits of the creature, or where it's going to appear at a certain time, or you can't survive.
Yeah, you'll be dead pretty quick.
You'd be dead pretty quick. So I, as a kid, I had this level of intimacy with my local stream that I don't think I'll ever achieve again in any capacity, with all the distractions that I have as an older person. But I was trying to catch the fish, and I was drawing the fish. And the drawing, well, there were two forms of representation really that I was engaged in that I think helped me become more intimate with the fish. One was drawing the fish using watercolor paint on paper to make a representation or a picture of a fish, an imitation, let's say. The other form of imitation or representation that I was engaged in was actually making the lures to catch the fish. So I was fly fishing at least some of the time, and I was tying these little imitations of things that trout eat. So many of us have fly fished, but for anybody who hasn't,
Yeah.
or tied flies, you take fur and feathers in different ways and tie them to a hook to create essentially a little sculpture of, let's say, an insect that a trout is eating. So the fisherman, I think it looks like an insect. I made it to look like what I think an insect looks like. And if I cast that thing out into the stream and a trout looks at it and also thinks it looks like an insect and moves towards it and eats it, then my brain and the fish's brain have actually connected through this translation device, this representation of an insect, mm-hmm. which I think is a pretty remarkable thing, that my brain and a fish's brain can actually join through this interface of the lure, this device of artifice. And we do it in other ways too, like making a duck decoy draws the ducks closer, or imitating the call of a duck or an elk to bring the elk closer. Or even in some cultures, they would dress up in the skin of a reindeer or something to get the reindeers to come closer and sort of do this dance imitation. I think it still happens in parts of Siberia, but one of the dangers in this culture, in this book that I read, the name of which I can't remember right now, in this anthropologist who was trying to learn about these people's relationship with the reindeer, they were afraid that if their imitation of the reindeer was too good, that they could cross into the world of the reindeer and never come back to the human world.
Oh, wow.
So there's been an understanding, I think, in our deep past that communication happens through representation. I mean, there's our language, our drawings, our paintings, our lures. We can't transmit a thought directly from my brain to your brain telepathically without using an intermediary tool.
Yeah.
And those tools are representation. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I've been engaged in different forms of representation that have allowed me to communicate. One is through painting, which allows me to communicate my love of the natural world to other people. Another is, making lures that allows me to communicate with a non-human animal.
Sure.
Anyway, these are some of the things I think about. But
I love all that. And I could ask you 100 follow-up questions on that, but when you're kind of a broader question, I know that reading and studying both the natural world, history, literature, all that is a big part of what you do. Do you also study philosophy? Because there's a philosopher that I follow named Sam Harris. He's got a podcast, and he, like you were mentioning about your kid's picture of a tree. It's not actually a tree. And I think Sam Harris is the one that introduced me this. It's some painting that I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah. Magritte, the pipe.
Yeah, this is not a pipe. And so how do you sharpen these ideas, these kind of philosophical ideas? Are they things you come up with on your own through your own thought, or are you actively reading philosophy or other things that help you to kind of put some corral these ideas you have into thoughts that can be communicated so clearly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Most of the time they emerge as inquiries or queries in my head, like something's agitating me about, and in the case of language, it started with my love of trout, and I couldn't find a book on the trout in North America. So in the local library, this is before the internet in the 80s. Mm-hmm. So at 9 years old, I was like, well, I'll try to put together a book on the trout in North America. So I started writing letters to departments of wildlife around the country and got nice responses from people who'd studied particular types of trout their whole lives, and they sent me papers they'd published and photos. And I'll get back to Magritte's pipe in a little bit.
Yeah.
So I started making a list of all the trout I wanted to paint for this book. But I ran into this interesting kind of problem, I guess, which was that no two biologists that I was corresponding with could agree on how many species of trout there were. And not only could they not agree on how many species of trout there were, they couldn't agree on what a species even was. So, and at the same time, my father, who had started his career in the merchant marine, had become a science teacher, and he was on his own personal. He he's still alive, but he was, and his father too, were very much into self-learning, like reading all the time. And he was reading poetry like Robert Frost and Emily Dickinson. And even though he was from South America, he'd sort of fall in love with New England, but for some reason, and our poets and literature and Thoreau and Emerson. But he was also reading Stephen Jay Gould and E.O. Wilson, these prominent evolutionary biologists. So he was always talking about evolution and how we all are descended from common ancestors going back hundreds of millions of years. And I started thinking like, well, how the problem here is that if things evolve on this great messy timeline or continuum, how do we draw neat lines between things if they're all connected, you know? And really that was a problem I was running into with these trout. They would be isolated in different lakes for 10,000 years because of a glaciation, and then some ice dam would break and they'd get reintegrated and they'd hybridize. And I was coming to see the world as, you know, interconnected and constantly changing. And the basic paradox in my head was like, I have to come up with a list of names of these fish that I love and paint them for this book, when really I know that what I'm coming to find out is that these lines that we draw in nature in order to have units that we can name to trade knowledge is kind of a fiction. And as I dug deeper, and, you know, this was the agitation that I couldn't come up with a list of the species of trout in North America because the biologists who studied them could not agree how many there were, because really what's happening is we're applying a tool, language, to a world that doesn't have words on it. And we expect the map that we use to communicate and navigate the world to reflect the terrain. But the map is something totally different. And this is not my, you asked if I read philosophy, this quote, "The map is not the territory," or "the map is not the terrain," was from a European philosopher named Alfred Korbushki. Let me look up his name. Alfred Korzybski. And it's similar to what you reference of the René Magritte painting, where he paints a picture of a pipe and underneath it writes in French, "This is not a pipe." Because a kid might go up to it and say, "Oh, look, mommy, it's a pipe." And the mom will say, "Oh, yeah, you're right, it's a pipe." But really, it's not a pipe. It's a two-dimensional representation of a pipe. But we're so used to exchanging information through representations that we forget that this is just a picture of a pipe. Yeah. It's a map. It's not the actual world. And what a big part of my work is about is reminding people, hey, shake this person up a little, including myself, and say, stop living through representations. Like, look at the world. The world is something very different, but we don't like the actual world because we don't like messiness. We don't like what we can't find a neat order for. We don't like the neighbor that stops mowing their lawn because we think they're crazy, or they have, come down with some kind of mental illness, because why aren't they trimming their hedges? Like, you go down to a place like Jupiter, Florida, where there's a lot of wealthy old people. Yeah. There's people they hire to pick up every dead leaf, every palm frond that falls in a storm, because every time they see something that's decaying, it breaks the illusion of permanence that they want to uphold. Because if you maintain an illusion that you have control over nature, that you can cut your hedges in neat geometric shapes, and they're like that every day that you go back to your place, then it gives you this illusion that things aren't changing. And because if you see things change, then it breaks that illusion. You're reminded of your mortality every single day. Yep. What we're trying to do all the time is defy our thoughts about death. Yeah, that's what I try to do. So really what this is about is humans trying to impose order on the natural world. And one of the chapters, I've been working on a book about this naming and ordering nature thing for like 15, 20 years. And I've put out versions of the writing in different publications, like a catalog I did for an exhibition I had at the Yale University Art Gallery. And it was called Art, Artifact, Artifice. And it was how we about how we put objects into different categories and different institutions, like what ends up in a natural history museum versus an art museum. But so we sort of draw lines between things, and we live by those lines and we die by those lines, because once we make the lines, we defend the lines. And they can be lines between species of trout. They can be racial lines. They can be gender identity lines. They can be any of the problems that we face or the issues we face in modern society are really about humans trying to create order where it doesn't necessarily exist. And the term I use around this, which is probably going to be a chapter in this book I've been working on, is the myth of order. So we sort of create this myth in our heads. Again, it's because once we create a map, and the map reflects how the human mind works. So then we like it because it's made in our image, and we defend it. But really, we have to let go of that map. One way to do that, if you read Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, is by taking psychotropic drugs.
Yeah, that is one way.
Not totally recommended, but another way, is maybe to meditate or draw or run. But how do we break out of that sort of love of order or representation? But to answer your question, I guess, so that was the agitation. The original agitation was, I can't put together a list of trout, but I need to if I want to make a book on the trout of North America. So I did decide on the list, and basically I painted a trout for every name that somebody had given for a fish. And I wrote about the cultural history of those naming events, like a couple of the fish in the Western North America were named by David Starr Jordan, who was the first president of Stanford University, and a very interesting guy, but also an ichthyologist. And he was one of my sort of early heroes until I found out that he was one of the leaders of the eugenics movement.
Oh, yeah.
As was Luis Agassiz at Harvard, who one of the trout from New Hampshire, this trout from Dublin Pond, was named Salmo Agassiz after him. And was one of my favorite painters as a kid. Luis Agassiz Fuertes was named after Agassiz. He was a Swiss naturalist who ended up teaching at Harvard. But anyway, you could obviously consider Darwin's Origin of Species a book of philosophy in a way, because it really shifted everybody's perceptions. And Darwin said in the Origin of Species that species are arbitrary terms for convenience. He knew that the species term really wasn't definable, and he even said that it was laughable that people try to come up with a definition for it. At the same time, it's necessary to have these terms and definitions because we couldn't communicate without them. So I do read philosophy. I guess more accurately, I try to. So there's a book next to me by Michel Foucault called This Is Not a Pipe, which is sort of about Magritte's painting. And Nietzsche, there's a book here on truth and lies in a non-moral sense, in which he also talks about words and, how they can't really reflect the world in a perfect one-to-one way. Yeah. Another book near me is Aldous Huxley's The Divine Within, in which there's an essay about, again, language, the limitations of language, but again, we can't expect language to do everything because it's just a tool. What I have trouble with are some of the terms. I'm really bad at retaining terms. So after reading a lot about what a natural kind is in philosophy, I still don't really understand what a natural kind is. Or if you ask me, was Stephen Jay Gould a realist or a nominalist, I would say he's both, but I'm not quite sure what those terms mean. I've tried to read Wittgenstein, and if I can't understand the philosopher, then I'll go interview somebody who's an expert in that field, and that sometimes helps. So the answer is, I guess, the inquiries sort of come based on my interests, and then I try to find out what other people have written about them or said about them, and then those things that I find out help me articulate them, like the Korbushki quote, "The map is not the territory."
I love it. I love all that. You need to Well, you got a lot going on, but I'll be very excited to read your book when you're done with it.
Oh, thank you. Were you going to say I need to finish it?
I started saying that, and I'm like, I don't need this. He doesn't need to hear that from me.
No, the problem is, like, I've written probably 2,000 pages that I won't even look at. I'll just scrap them and write it again from the beginning. But
is that just organizing is that just the way you organize your thoughts? Kind
of, yeah. They're definitely in chapters, and the thoughts are, and there's some organization, like there's a chapter, for instance, about the kind of what you actually go through to name a new species. So for that chapter, it's about a trip I took with my friend Christoph Ziskowski, who's the bird collection manager at the Peabody Museum at Yale, and we put together an expedition to Suriname, this former Dutch colony north of Brazil in South America, to look for undescribed species. And what's the process you go through to name something? So you have to usually try to go to a place where people haven't been, because if there's people there, there's names on everything.
Yep.
So remote places have fewer named entities. So we helicoptered into the center of the country because there'd never been a biological expedition there, and got dropped off for 3 weeks with nets and guns. And really the process of naming involves collecting things, which is just killing, so there's this sort of dark side of naming and documenting nature, where if you don't collect a specimen, i.e. kill it and bring it back to an institution and put a tag on it, it doesn't really exist in human reality. Yeah. So it's a really complex and fascinating topic. Part of the reason I don't like to finish books sometimes is because I'm afraid, like, what am I going to do when I finish this? Like, I've been immersed in this for so long. The first task that God gives humans in the Old Testament is to put names on things, and there's a lot of commentary about what that means. Is it a way of dominating the world when you name it? One of my favorite naming stories is by the science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin, who died recently, called She Unnames Them, where Eve goes through the garden unnaming all the animals that Adam had named. And when she's done, she hands her name back to Adam and walks out of the garden in protest. So she thought that when we put labels on things, it creates this divide between us and them. And when you take the names away, it kind of releases us from those boundaries. Really, if you get into an inquiry about naming, I feel, which is about taking the interconnected world, drawing lines between things and labeling the pieces, it ultimately becomes an inquiry about the lines and the boundaries, and what do those boundaries mean? And so a lot of the exhibitions I've been engaged with are about boundaries, whether it's the line around Yellowstone National Park or barbed wire fences in Texas. But to me, they're all related to how we use language, or how our brains need to sort of fragment the world in order to understand it.
One question for you about place. I feel like your sense of place and your appreciation for place and your understanding of your place, where you grew up and where you live now. I mean, very, very few people on earth have such a close connection with their place as you do. But then you go off to the far corners of the world and to study the plants and animals. And so you have to establish some version of that connection with place. But compared to what you have with your home, I mean, it's like if you have the best friend in the world, or you talk about your wife, and then everything else every other relationship in the world pales in comparison to that. And so, for example, the new project Trespassers down in Texas, that is a far, far different landscape than where you are based. But how did you go about establishing enough of a connection with that place to feel like you could dive in and really understand it at the level that you like to understand things, to represent these grasslands, for example, in art?
Well, even though the world is vast, and even though what we call ecosystems, which are all connected to each other, are different, deserts versus oceans, let's say, there are just so many commonalities between these places. One of them is the connection people have with land and water and organisms, particular people, not everybody these days. So I guess I come back here to the street where I grew up to think, to make things. And then when I travel, I make new inquiries, but I don't think I'm forcing them into the same themes, but the same themes just keep coming up over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. So with also, I learned from a young age, I think, that if you can find the right people, you can learn so much. I mean, so much, like in a relatively short period of time. Like when I was a kid, around 13, I got caught fishing illegally by a game warden named Joe Haynes in one of the reservoirs in town. I don't think Joe finished high school. He didn't have any really formal education. I'd lived in this, exact environment that he grew up for, at that point, 13 years, up until the point I was caught. I thought I knew my environment pretty well. And then after catching me, his son had moved to Colorado. So I sort of filled this hole in his life, and my family kind of broken up. My mom left when I was 9. So we sort of fell into each other's lives. But the point is that this one mentor taught me so much about my local environment that, in a couple of years before I went to college, let's say. So those kind of figures have reappeared in my life. When I traveled around, I did this book where I traveled the latitude line of my home around the world fishing, but really it was research for a book on the trout of the world.
Yeah.
There was a guy named Johannes Schuffman who I met, who kind of through Robert Benke, who was the foremost sort of trout person in the world at that time at Colorado State University. But Johannes lived in southern Austria and is a baker by profession, but he was the most knowledgeable person by far about Salmo truta, the brown trout, which is native from Iceland all the way to the Pamir Mountains in Afghanistan, from Arctic Russia to North Africa, because he traveled every opportunity he had to, like, places nobody would go to look for trout, like Kyrgyzstan. So I traveled with this guy for 7 years and just like downloaded everything that I could learn. And I painted, pictures of all the trout that we saw. And I basically documented everything that he knew and married with the experiences we had together. And of course I acknowledged him, but that I couldn't have done any of that work without him. So in Texas, it was like, okay, this is a new environment. It's not always like that I'm seeking that person out, but I kind of am lucky enough to find them.
Yeah, well, I think you attract them. Your curiosity and your enthusiasm attracts like-minded people.
I mean, over and over, I've been so lucky to meet these crazy people who are obsessed with what they love and do. And another case, I did a project where I painted 35 Atlantic fish life-size based on individual fish that I traveled to see. Like the blue marlin was an individual blue marlin, 800 pounds, that I saw caught in the Cape Verde Islands off West Africa. And I paint all the scabs and scars on that individual fish, again, to sort of break that map idea that the world is a reduction, or that's all blue marlin are the same, for instance. So I wanted to paint a swordfish. So I drove up this town, Woods Harbor, Nova Scotia, from Connecticut, like 20 hours or something, to try to get on a harpoon boat, because that was the best way to see like a swordfish free swimming. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and then sort of on the boat and in its living colors if possible. But I walked out to the dock, and it took me a couple of years to actually make preparations to get on a commercial swordfish boat. So I had a boat I was going to get on, and then I walk out on the dock, and there's this boat unloading 13 swordfish, and this old guy who kind of looks like the captain is standing there. And I didn't have the courage to sort of talk to him, but I was watching the swordfish being unloaded, and their heads and tails were cut off, and they're all just sort of these lumps of gray flesh. And he says to me, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, I just drove up from Connecticut because I want to paint a swordfish life-size in its living colors." And he said, "Well, you never seen a blue on land like the color of a swordfish." He said, if you ever met a girl with the eyes the color of a swordfish, you would leave whoever you were with and go with her." And he said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, I was going to go out with this other boat for, 7 or 8 days. He's like, well, you should come with us because we have the biggest boat in the fleet with the tallest, mast, and we can spot more fish. And so I went out with him and it just turned out to be one of the most incredible experiences of my life. Anyway, I can tell you about the Texas thing. Sorry for the digression, but
love the digression.
The Texas thing came about because there was a curator at the Amon Carter who had borrowed a work of mine for an exhibition, and then that started a sort of conversation about possibly doing an exhibition. And all the shows that they do with living artists, contemporary artists, are all about Texas. So this curator, Spencer Wigmore, who I worked with, had grown up in Minnesota and had learned about remnant prairies as a kid. And I think his parents even had grown, some prairie plants in their backyard, and he'd been involved in some restoration projects with the Boy Scouts. And so he was thinking of looking for an artist who could do a project about Texas prairies and grasslands. And so he asked if I'd be interested, and I said, yeah, of course. And at that point, 2.5 years ago, grass was just something in your lawn.
Yeah.
It was growing in the highway medians along, I-95 or the Merritt Parkway here in Connecticut. But I always did have, as I mentioned early on, this love of open meadows. And I'd done books that had involved native prairie plants. Like I did this children's book, Bird, Butterfly, Eel, about a monarch, an American eel, and a barn swallow that live in the same farm in New England in the summer, and in the fall they all migrate to totally different places. The eel goes out to the middle of the Atlantic, the swallow goes to Argentina, and the monarch goes to Mexico. So this idea that things can be together in one season and in totally different places in another season, breaking all kinds of boundaries, by the way, as they move, trespassing across state lines and boundaries between nations, oceans, and land. That's partly where the trespasser name for the exhibition comes from, because, animals trespass across the lines that we impose on the world. But anyhow, so for that book, I'd painted some of these, the monarchs eating my favorite milkweed species, this orange milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa. And I painted these grasses that I'd seen them growing with. And on my first trip to Texas, that Spencer and his colleague Maggie Adler had organized for me to meet some ranch owners and ranch managers and see different properties, restoration sites, and remnant prairie in the hill country in Texas and Edwards Plateau. And so I went on that trip, and I think the first place we went, the ranch manager was touring us around the property, and he stopped by this stand of yellow Indian grass, and he was like, look at this yellow Indian grass. Look at this. And I was like, he was so excited about this grass. I'd never heard anybody rapturize about grass before. And I was like, wow, what the hell is going on here? This is like grass.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the introduction of my, I guess, understanding of the Texans' love of grass, maybe partly because that's what Texas was built on, like grazing animals, eating prairie grasses, but it's obviously a lot deeper than that. But I on that trip learned about the big four prairie grass species: big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass. And I was like, you know what? I know I've seen these grasses before back at home. At least this one, little blue stem, which a lot of people are like, this is my favorite grass. Yeah. And I looked back in my children's book, and I was like, that's the grass I painted from this meadow near my house.
Oh,
and
wow.
There's a meadow behind this school near my house that has, I came back home that September, and I actually found two of these prairie grass species, big blue stem and little blue stem, in this meadow. And I even sent pictures to a grass expert to make sure I wasn't misidentifying them. And I also learned from one of the people I'd met in the hill country that they said, well, actually these grass species are also native to New England. And there's people at Cornell and other places who are studying these grasses. So I reached out to them and I started looking around, and I learned that, the prairies really and grasslands ran from the East Coast all the way out, to Wyoming.
Yeah.
Pretty much. And that the way that the land, it was like a complete shift in my thinking. Like the way the land had been managed was like opposite what I'd been taught, that like the New England was this forest primeval. And when the Europeans came here, they were gaga over the trees because they'd cut everything down in Europe, and they're like, wow, look at all the ship masts and all of this stuff we can build. Mm-hmm. And that was true. There were forests, of course, but a big part of New England was managed as a grassland by indigenous people through burning, which had been that was not something that I knew about 2.5 years ago. So I started reading books like William Cronin's Changes in the Land, which is about early New England and how fire was used as a tool for thousands of years by indigenous people. So you say like, oh, you go to a place like Texas, which is totally foreign as opposed to Connecticut. But then I see all these connections between where I grew up. In East Texas looks a lot like Connecticut and
sure.
The Oklahoma border and Arkansas. And we have a lot of the same species of plants. Obviously, West Texas out in the Davis Mountains looks quite different, but still there's overlap in flora and fauna. But what was amazing, what's been amazing about this project is that learning about Texas grasses has taught me more about my home ecosystem than I would have learned just sitting here and observing, because I had no idea that. So I grew up next to this farm, which I've been trying to protect pieces of because I now live next to it. During COVID, we were able to acquire 20 acres of it, and I'm trying to keep protecting more of it. But the fields that we have now, maybe there's 14 acres of meadows. I didn't know until I went on this trip that the grasses growing in these meadows were all introduced from Europe as hay crops, timothy and orchard grass. And there was one native grass now that has been growing in these, two, I guess deer's tongue is one, but one that really looks like a grass, like a real grass, prairie grass. And it's Andropogon virginica, sometimes called broom sedge bluestem. And that grass is like making kind of a comeback in these meadows. The meadows are hayed still, which is why they're still open. But I just all of a sudden was like, these meadows that I loved, I'm like, they're just full of invasives. It's all non-natives. And that's been a conundrum too, like in my head, how tightly do you hold on to the native versus non-native thing? So I started trying to establish about a 1/4 acre of native grasses on the property here, starting about 2 years ago with seeds and plugs. So I now have those 4 major prairie grass species growing here, and it's going to be an ongoing experiment. And I'm learning about like Long Island, like a big part of Long Island, which is across Long Island Sound from us here. You can see it from different hills in town. A lot of it was a grassland, and some of the piece of evidence that there was a lot of grassland in New England is that we had a native prairie chicken here called a heath hen, which is now extinct. It went extinct.
Wow. I didn't know. I've never heard of that.
Martha's Vineyard in the 1920s. I went to the Peabody recently to see specimens. The Natural History Museum at Yale has specimens from Massachusetts. And this is a species that can't survive without a significant amount of grassland. But the person who's taught me the most during this project is a guy that I ended up meeting named Matt White, who wrote a beautiful book called Prairie Time. And Matt sort of has become my Johannes of the grasslands. And we traveled together. Most recently, we drove from North Texas through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, part of southern Iowa, back through Missouri, Arkansas to Texas in like 5 days.
Oh, wow.
Just to visit a handful of cemetery prairies where, these ancient grass species and all their root systems and the wildflowers are still intact just because people buried their dead there starting in the early 1800s. And because it was never plowed or overgrazed, these little pockets where dead people were buried have become remnants of a former time of the old prairies when around them everything's been plowed up and planted with corn or overgrazed, or fire suppression also has been a big issue with it goes on and on. But so I've gone deep into the grass thing, and it's taught me a lot about my home.
I would not have expected that. I love
I didn't either.
That.
Yeah, I didn't.
And for people listening, James's show starts on September 16th of this year, 2023, runs through January, and he and I will be doing a deep dive into everything you want to know about Texas grass and James's study of Texas grass live at the Eamon Carter on, what day is it? January 11th. So I can't wait for that. I'm really excited for that. One more question about your artistic process.
Yeah.
Have you ever, it seems like you've been fully obsessed in the best possible way since you started fishing, but have you ever gone through a artistic slump where you just weren't motivated, weren't curious, just kind of sluggish, or have you been pretty zoned in throughout your entire journey?
Yeah, I guess what I haven't really talked about, which is really the main part of my career, is making art. My dealer, his name's Wakas Wajahat. He comes down on me hard sometimes, saying, you give these talks and you're not really talking about art. You're talking about the environment and, your inquiries and whatever it might be. And for me, though, it's all part of the same thing. And I guess partly why I'm interested in biodiversity and protecting it is because evolution is the great creative force that made everything. I mean, there's no greater artistic force than nature. And I feel like humans, as products of evolution, extend that need to make things, and making art is one of the extensions of that process, because making new forms is ultimately beneficial for our survival. But so have I had a creative slump? The hardest times for me creatively, emotionally, with the kind of making is when I complete a project that I've really loved working on for a long time. Like when I shipped off the work for this Eamon Carter exhibition, I was really kind of down I'm still sort of coming out of it.
Yeah.
And I'm making things, but I haven't really actually picked up a brush in probably 3 weeks. I've been kind of reorienting my head in terms of what the next project is while not letting go of the previous project, and definitely exploring ways to continue the grassland inquiry at other institutions, potentially in Texas or elsewhere. But anyone out there who's a curator or museum director listening, but then I see that there's threads between projects, and I know that this basic idea that has been extended through the Prairie Project for me, that humans draw lines in nature where lines don't exist, and nature trespasses across those lines, or that trespassing is necessary for the health of nature. So the two main examples, well, fire is the big one. Fire, we now think or know that the indigenous people set fire to everything, basically, a lot, because grasses evolved to like fire because lightning was a natural force that would set fires. They just increased the pace because they saw that, like, the more fire we had, the less brush and trees grow, which means more grass, which means more protein for grazing animals, which means higher protein yield, more animals, more food. So that seems to be the basic formula for thousands of years, heavily managed, all of North America. And what happened when the Europeans came is they started putting up fences, drawing property lines, putting up houses, and they naturally suppressed fire because fire doesn't obey boundaries. It blows. If the wind's blowing, it can burn hundreds of thousands of acres. So that was the end, basically, of the grasslands, along with overgrazing and plowing. So part of what helps me through the periods of a sort of the terminalness of a project ending, and the sort of, anxiety and depression that comes with that is that these themes continue. And then I look toward future projects, and I realize that there's more things that I want to do before I die than I possibly can complete. And that both gives me anxiety and hope.
Yeah.
Because I know I have more things to work on. And one thing that came out of this Texas show that's looks like it's going to be part of a next exhibition, which again helps to minimize the lulls, is that when I was painting these grasses, I was painting the shadow that the grass and the flowers cast on the paper. And what that does is, it situates the thing in a place. It's not just floating on the paper. It means that I plucked the grass, so I actually yanked it out and put it on the paper, and it's sitting there casting a shadow. It acknowledges that there's a light source, the sun, outside of the edge of the paper, but it also allows me to show the architecture of the object from another perspective. So if I'm staring at the grass straight ahead, I can draw the grass, but then the shadow might be coming from a different angle, so it shows me what the thing looks like from another side. And I started thinking about, because of my interest in representation through drawing or making lures or whatever, that a shadow is a representation of the thing, but it's made in the absence of something, in the absence of light. So there's a sort of like presence and absence simultaneously with a shadow. So the next exhibition one of the future projects I've been working on, which is supposed to be at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth in 2025, is about memories and shadow and land and how those things kind of fit together. So yeah, I do. I guess there are periods of time when I definitely aren't making work actively, but I'm thinking a lot about what the next thing is. What I've had trouble doing, and I'd like to try to get over that, is just making work for the sake of making work, like just painting for the sake of painting. I've always been very inquiry and project oriented.
Yeah.
And I think that can be good, but it can also not be good for the creative process. It could be because I was raised in a kind of pragmatic way. It was artist was never really like a profession that was viable.
Yeah.
It was like I was studying to become an architect, and somehow I just stumbled on the art thing. But really, ultimately, it's what I've always been doing, is drawing, and making things. So it's just a label that seems very lofty, but I like it because it's probably one of the most ambiguous labels you could probably put on somebody. As an artist, you can do pretty much whatever you want. Yeah. So to answer your question, one thing I'd like to try to do is just make work without a particular project in mind, which would require me loosening up a little bit and taking advice that I give other people that I never take myself.
Talking about, I mentioned that philosopher Sam Harris. He said, in some ways, this is a paraphrase, but he basically said, in some ways, the ultimate wisdom is the ability to take your own advice.
Oh yeah. Well, with the ordering thing, the map is not the territory and all that baloney. I preach it all the time, but I hold very tightly on to my own order, when I walk into my studio, my workspace, you would think that a bomb went off. Like there's papers everywhere and there's books piled up, but this is my order. There is an extreme, if someone came in and moved a piece of paper and I saw it moved, it creates a visceral like pain in my body. So it's part of my obsessive compulsive issues. So I guess part of the reason why I've been engaged in an inquiry about order is because I have an overactive sense of order. I guess partly because of this, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is just a label.
Yeah.
But so I have trouble taking my own advice is the answer.
Well, whatever you're doing is working. And so don't change it too much. I mean, obviously keep pushing yourself, but I love your art, but the actual art that I can look at, like in these awesome books that I've got in front of me right now, like it's beautiful, but what I really, really love is that's just the tip of the iceberg. And when you start talking to you about the way you think about things and just how complex your thinking is on all these subjects, I just love it. And I'm so glad that I get a chance to continue the conversation with you in person in front of a bunch of people. It's going to be, and then we'll record that. We'll put that as episode. So we'll definitely be having a part 2, but any kind of parting words for the listeners, Mountain and Prairie listeners, they're all over the place. They love the West, love nature. I mean, everything you're talking about will resonate with the listeners. You got any very, very wise words to impart?
Oh my God. Oh boy. Wise words.
No pressure.
No pressure. Gosh, again, it would be advice that I would give myself, like try to be present and look around and enjoy being in nature. I have trouble doing that myself. It's like I feel like I'm most connecting with nature when I'm drawing it, but because drawing, again, it is kind of like a meditation. It helps me slow down. And it's the one thing that, I guess maybe my advice would be bring a pencil or bring a box of colored pencils and some paper with you on your next hike. Sit down somewhere and just draw something, because I think you'll find that if you haven't done that, drawing will give you an insight into that experience that you wouldn't have otherwise. And when I do, like in Texas, for instance, I bring pieces of paper with me out into the prairie, and it's really hard to draw actually in the prairie because it's hot as FUCK sometimes. And so I try to find like a shed somewhere or a place preferably with air conditioning, because there are actually kind of problems with painting when you're sweating on paper and you're just covered in water and you're trying to paint watercolors. But when I have drawn things out in nature, those things can be cool actually to be integrated with the work of art too, the dirt on your arm, the sweat. You could even paint with sweat, I guess. But when I have sat down for even 30 minutes or 15 minutes and drawn something in front of me, I can remember that experience in a way that I can't if I just take a picture with my phone and walk away. Mm-hmm. It's something about that experience and environment has actually become part of my brain and part of my skin. And I've found no other way other than writing in my journal, through which I can achieve something like that, but not in the same way that I can with drawing. So I guess my advice would be to try to go out and draw something.
I love it, man. And I'm excited to meet you in person in January. Yeah. And thank you for everything you're doing. I'm so glad to know you, and I'm excited to get to spend a few days with you in Texas.
Thank you, Ed. And it'll be rodeo season in Fort Worth, so maybe we can go to the rodeo.
Oh yeah, definitely. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.